All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 30, Section 4, East Asia, 1931 to 1945. So East Asia, if we recall, is mostly China and Japan. And the story has been, so far at least for Japan, Japanese expansion. And that continues between the years of 1931 and 1935. By the 1930s, the ultra-nationalists, again, those who are, nationalists, but kind of take it to an extreme, so we might call these the extreme nationalists, believed that the only way for Japan to thrive economically was through economic self-sufficiency. This was related to the economic downturn during the Great Depression. And the idea was to create a country in Japan in which resources like oil, iron, steel, that they wouldn't have to trade anybody for them, but they would rather just acquire them themselves. So, Japanese expansion had already been occurring, pre-1930s. You could think of places like Taiwan, Korea, which had become a Japanese possession. The Japanese took over former German territories in World War I. So the fact that Japan was acquiring more and more and more territory wasn't necessarily new. In 1931, Japan has their eyes set on Manchuria. The Manchurian Incident of 1931 was the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Manchuria, if you're not familiar, is northern China, right? So in 1931, Japan invaded northern China. Now, what the Japanese claimed was that Manchuria, which they called Manchukuo, so Manchukuo is the name for the quote-unquote independent Manchurian state. The Japanese claimed that they were simply protecting an independent nation. Manchukuo was not recognized really by any other powers. And what the reality was here in the Manchurian incident was, even though the Japanese claimed a new independent state in the form of Manchukuo created, this was just simply more of the same. This was adding towards Japanese expansion. So again, now even further territories coming up under Japanese occupation. Meanwhile, China itself is really in no position to prevent Japanese aggression. It's certainly something that the Chinese are worried about, but there's no real stable government. Recall that when we talked about China, the Qing dynasty, the last Chinese dynasty, came to an end in 1911. After that, various local warlords ruled, we might say from 1911 through the 1920s. But then it was the Kuomintang, or the Chinese nationalists, which established control or began to establish control in the 1920s, and they were led by Chiang Kai-shek, right? So he is the leader of the Kuomintang. Again, here we'll just call these the nationalists in China. And he is the leader of Kuomintang. And in some respects, the closest thing to a military, hard to read, military dictator of China, more or less. Doesn't have full control of the Chinese continent, but is probably the person who is most poised, in China. And Chiang Kai-shek is concerned about two things. On the one hand, Chiang Kai-shek is concerned about Japanese aggression, right? The fact that the Japanese were able to take away northern China and claim it for themselves certainly is a problem. But also a problem for Chiang Kai-shek is the Chinese communists, who for a time period in the 1920s had actually worked with the nationalists. Both the communists and the nationalists effectively took power away from the warlords. But what Chiang Kai-shek did in the aftermath of that was the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, and that was in 1927 to purge members of the Communist Party. So this led, right? So Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalists, teamed up with the communists, but then purged them, got rid of them, once the warlords were defeated. And so this led to the Chinese Civil War, which put the nationalists versus, the communists. And it raged, we'll say, from 1927 through all the way to the end of World War II, and even afterwards, 1949. Very long civil war. The leader of the communists was Mao Zedong. All right, so he is the leader of the communists. And even though the communists were greatly outnumbered, were outgunned, outmanned, they persisted due to some innovative strategies. One of them, and these were the strategies that were employed by Mao Zedong and the communists to fight against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. One was to treat the peasants well. Peasants were really the backbone of Mao's support. The communists treated them well, and educated many of the peasants. It was somewhat ironic that a communist movement for the working class, for the industrial workers, ultimately became a peasant movement, and the peasants really liked Mao Zedong, where Chiang Kai-shek mostly ruled over the peasants, took stuff from them, and held little regard for them. Mao Zedong also moved to get rid of a lot of the very restrictive laws that govern the lives of women in China. So, for example, laws regarding divorce, practices known as foot binding that women had to do, arranged marriage. Just 1 hour. All these things were banned by Mao Zedong to get some of the support from women. And the tactics that Mao used was guerrilla warfare, which was quote-unquote hit and run tactics. It was to dress like civilians, to not fight a conventional war. And typically guerrilla warfare is a tactic used by a weaker army versus a strong one. And that's what Mao used against the nationalists. However, though, the nationalists in the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek certainly had the upper hand, and they relentlessly pursued the communists. The communists went on what was known as the Long March, and this was really the campaign by the Chinese communists to evade the nationalists. And I want to say this was from 1934 through 1937, I want to say. And so essentially the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, were relentlessly pursuing Mao Zedong, looking to get rid of every single last member of the Chinese Communist Party. But Mao Zedong and the communists continued to march, evade, capture, and ultimately the nationalists gave up on their campaign. Mao Zedong and the communists still retained a presence in China. Now, of course, this was the case until 1937, and that's when Japan invaded the mainland of China. So the invasion of China, so this is a Japanese invasion of China, right? Not just Manchuria, but all of China, 1937. The Japanese took over many of the population centers, including the capital city of Beijing. Like we learned in the chapter about German expansion and Italian expansion, here, once again, the League of Nations really does nothing. Only really emboldens Japan to, aggressively attack their neighbors. And what you saw in the invasion of China in 1937 was a sneak peek into how warfare would be characterized in World War II. In fact, some historians look at 1937 and say, look, this was really the start of World War II, right? It wasn't the Nazis in Poland 2 years later, but in fact here in Japan. And one thing that made World War II much different was the amount of civilian deaths. And in this case, it's mostly the Chinese civilians who are now under Japanese occupation. Whereas before, wars were fought and there was a distinct difference between the home front and the battlefront. World War I, think of trenches. Here, the wars move very quickly. Enemy powers take over land very quickly. And so in this case, when it came to fighting Japanese occupation, it turned out to be the communists who had previously used guerrilla fighting that were the most effective fighters against the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were ineffective in trying to fight the Japanese in a conventional way. So we'll say about communist guerrilla warfare, more effective at fighting Japan. And once again, the Japanese invasion kind of put a little bit of a hold on the Chinese Civil War. For the time being, both the communists and the nationalists focused on fighting Japan. So communist guerrilla warfare, more effective at fighting Japan than conventional nationalists. And we mean, Chiang Kai-shek. Civilian deaths were, again, a sort of a definition of what World War II was about. In China, very bad atrocities were carrying out. Atrocities were carried out by pretty much all occupying armies during World War II, but the atrocities committed by the Japanese in China were especially notorious not just for the brutality of it, but because it preceded a lot of the other atrocities carried out in Europe just 2 years later. The rape of Nanjing is a Chinese city, was the brutal killing of 200,000 Chinese civilians. Just one L. And quite literally the rape of thousands and thousands of women. These types of atrocities were protested by the League of Nations, but ultimately did not do much to step in to stop it. Meanwhile, the nationalists didn't do themselves any favor in an effort to try and prevent the Japanese from further pursuing the nationalist army. Chiang Kai-shek ordered the Yellow River dikes to be blown up. A dike is like a dam, so we might say dam destroyed. And that led to flooding, which killed approximately 800,000 Chinese civilians. So the death toll is being very, very, very high. And this was certainly something that made World War II different than the First World War. In the long run, while the Chinese continued to resist Japanese occupation, it ended up being the communists and the peasants who were seen in the most positive light by the Chinese people. And in fact, when the war was over, when the Chinese finally get rid of Japan, it's the communists who are kind of seen much more favorably than the nationalists, and eventually give them the upper hand once the war concludes. Here we got a map of China. We can get a little bit of a feel for sort of where we're talking about here. You can see all the territory that comes under Japanese occupation. So by 1938, everything in the brown, this is all under Japan, right, in this area, including, of course, Japan itself over here, and Taiwan, right? Don't forget about Taiwan. And then you could see some of the various movements of both the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists. These are the paths showing the Long March. So the dark, dark, dark blue looks like that is the Long March, right? Just sort of continuing to lead nationalist forces on this cat and mouse chase, you might say. This purple right here shows where the communists were the strongest before. After the Long March, this is where the communists pretty much held out. And again, once the Japanese invaded, both the nationalists and the communists fought against the Japanese.